This is a second video. It'll be They Won't Understand Too. And that first video, covered some of the material. And this might be my first actually short video. But I wanted to just kind of follow up a little bit on They Won't Understand, because it's such an important piece of the spiritual path. And I thought I would throw in, I might have to make a whole separate video about this, but I thought I would throw in also just the fact that when someone becomes a meditator in a serious way, let me put it this way. So I'm sort of following after what I was taught by my first really good meditation teacher who was not in the Christian tradition. And then also, because we're following a Christian tradition, and we're sort of modeling some of what we're doing after the monks and nuns. And sort of like their approach, how do they make themselves available to God's power? And some of what they do to make themselves available to God's power is not compatible with our lifestyle, and some of it is. And one of the areas that is, and I think this needs to be stressed over and over and over again, is that we must guard our leisure time above all other time. And, I think it was 8 years into my path before I could hear that without also hearing my father's voice in my head telling me to get up and get something done. And, being in trouble for not being awake and up and doing something by 8 a.m. So, we have like a sort of a doing mentality built into us. Many of us do. And, and it has its place. I mean, getting things done is really important. We have to get things done. But our leisure time and our alone time is some of the most important time we have as contemplatives. So we spend time in deep prayer and meditation. We spend time reading scripture. And at various points within our spiritual journey, we study theology. And we also spend time in self-examination. All of that is work to cultivate the soil so that something can grow. And what it is that grows is this spirituality, that Jesus begins to grow in us, that God begins to grow in us. And, especially if you're hitting the deeper stages of meditation and prayer, if you're hitting stage 4 or 5, then you're getting somewhat unconscious when you meditate. So there you're absorbing God's power, but you don't know what you're absorbing. You don't notice it. You're getting it, and it's having its effect in your life, but you don't know what it is. And so there's leisure time when you're not doing anything else. That's your most important time, because it's where you can open your mind and heart and will to God. But you remain conscious and you experience a relationship with God. And that can include, slow walks in the park, or, it can include some activity, slow, conscious activity. It doesn't have to be really formal. And I in fact prefer it not to be formal. If I was going to do that for a walk, I think a great approach would be just to go out at night and walk slowly, just in no hurry, so that the pace of that walk is conducive to your experience with the Holy Spirit. But that takes time. That takes an hour and a half, right? There's time that takes to be in the power of God. So a contemplative is gearing their whole lives around spending time with this power. And that gets into, they won't understand, and it isn't your fault. And now I want to say, and so what? It's a blessing that they won't understand. And we're just going to assume they're all really good people. But it's a blessing they won't understand, and it's a blessing that you're going to spend less time with them. Now, why would that be if they're really good people? Well, let's assume they all are. Most people are, there's a lot of good people in the world. Why is it a good thing we're not spending time with people? Well, because if our identities are somewhat formed by our family groups, right? by our family, and then it begins to extend into friendships, and then things we align to, institutions, education, things like that we align to, and we form our identities in relationship to these groups of people, and sometimes principles and ideas. And most of us were not raised in a family that really had come to some kind of deep transformation and was forming its identity based on a relationship with God and what God was doing in that soul, right? Like, because isn't that the goal? You know, I read a book, I can't remember the name of it now. It was a strange book on corporations and how much damage they've done by hiring professional psychologists to create marketing schemes that initiate a brand identity in a person, so that I'm an REI person, or I'm a Carhartt person, or I'm a LL Bean person. And they're just, you know, these psychologists are hired to create these sort of marketing plans and advertisement plans that create an identity that you can identify with that product, and then you're aligned to it. You become faithful to it. And I mean, within reason, it's probably not so bad, but why would that be a problem? Well, it's a problem because when we align to our family group for our identity, or a certain type of educational approach for our identity, or a certain degree for our identity, or when we just allow our identity to be formed by who we are in our group of friends, even. When that is what's forming our identity, it is idolatry. It is idolatry. And I don't mean that in the judgmental sense that now everyone's bad who does that. I don't mean that at all. But if you don't spend time alone, and a lot of time alone, where the persona you need to be in to be around people drops away, falls away, and you get underneath it and discover there's this other sort of state of being underneath that activity, that social activity. If you don't spend enough time to get away from that, you don't even begin to touch whatever the real self is, right? You know, what's really there underneath what we've formed and practiced. And, you know, I walked in on my daughter once practicing an identity in the mirror. I think she was 3 years old. And we all do that. And then we begin to see ourselves a certain way and then present ourselves a certain way. And all of that is the false self that needs to be eroded at until it dies. All of that is. And so time spent away from people, time spent alone, is the best way, because you actually get hours where you don't have to play those roles, and you get to experience and be for hours, you know, at a time, over a long period of time, which changes your neural pathways, which it forms the brain, forms consciousness. So we need time away. So what a blessing it is that we don't align to those groups enough to be there all the time anymore. Now, we can still love those people deeply, and we can maintain friendships with those people for a lifetime. But there has to just be more distance now. And that naturally happens. The fact is, if you're changing, your friends are going to want that distance just as much as you are. It's going to be a natural unfolding. And that needs to happen. You need that time alone. Speaking to the monk, I knew someone who never really was able to get the social connections they wanted. And, you know, and there's heartache in that, right? It's one thing to give up something you know you can have, right? You have it, you've already had it, you've been able to explore it, you know that it's yours, and you could willingly give that up. It can sometimes be harder for someone to give up something they wanted but could never get in the first place. That can be harder, you know? So I was speaking to somebody once who was in that sort of a space where they wanted to have those social connections, but they were never able to really fully get them. And then the spiritual path was sort of pulling them away from that. And, that's a difficult sort of a thing to go through. That's a difficult place to be. And so what does that mean for that person? How are they going to navigate that? Well, the monk that I work with told me just about this particular person. I don't know that he meant it for everyone, but I kind of took it almost as a principle. That person has been, according to the monk, preserved by God for the contemplative path. Preserved by God for the contemplative path. And the loneliness that they felt, even in childhood, where they just didn't quite fit in as well as the other kids with the group, although that is a heartache and a sadness to go through, it's also part of why that person found the contemplative path in the first place. And so whether you begin the path as a socialite, or you begin the path with someone who wishes you had had that and didn't, or someone who didn't get it and now resents everyone, there's a lot of work for wherever you're coming from. There's a lot of work to do to become authentic with all of this. We certainly can't have resentments towards social groups and people that have all of that. We certainly can't judge them, right? That's wrong, deeply wrong. We don't want that at all. And we certainly can't exist in a place where we forever crave it and are unable to attain it. That's no good either. So the best thing to do really is to embrace the monastic approach and say, well, look, the monks and nuns, by and large, to a great extent, they refuse special relationships. They refuse. They see I like this person way more than that person as a general kind of problem to avoid. And relationships that aren't based on purpose and meaning and depth are discouraged. And so is talking. for some monks, the monk that I know, it's a really strict order, so they had a vow of silence for really most of their lives. They just don't even talk very much. You can go talk to your confessor. You could talk about any deep spiritual matter that is important to talk about, and then all the rest of the talk that happens that's casual and doesn't come with deep purpose is just discouraged. Now, we're not following that path, but we do listen to it, right? We're informed by that, and we say, well, that's interesting. I could see where that might be valuable. And so here we are, you're called to this deep place, and your resonance in that deep place now makes you different, strange, odd, unable to share what's on your mind. Even in the midst of conversation, what's occurring to you is not what's occurring to someone else. What are your thoughts on this person? Well, I don't know what my thoughts are on this person. You might not have any thoughts on them. You might not have been thinking about them in that way. You might have just been experiencing them contemplatively. So there's all these different ways that where you're coming from doesn't fit in with normal conversation, and then that can be a pain to you. But it's a blessing too. Because now you have time to be alone. You don't want to really be there anyway, and they love you, but they don't want you there either, not all the time. And so, they want to talk about sometimes things that are really not right, that are wrong, and that aren't okay with you anymore. And you can't align to that, and they don't feel free. So space for you, between you and them, is helpful. It's good. And depending on the personality type, I know people that maintain still long-term relationships while on a deep contemplative path, but a distance has to be there between them and those people. Not a distance when they're together. There can be a closeness then. How often do you hang out, though? Is it every weekend? Probably not. Probably not. Especially if you work full-time and you're on this path, so now you've got this big thing, this behemoth in your life, which is a job, right? And that job takes a lot of time and energy. And sometimes the weekend is when God really has time to do some work with you. And not always, of course, right? Sometimes the work is to go and enjoy the world, of course. But sometimes the work is to be alone and to spend time with God, like a day could go like this. You get up, you meditate for an hour or so, and now it's 8 a.m. You're already meditating. You go for a walk. This is a weekend. You go for a walk at the park, and it's a wonderful walk, and you enjoy that fresh air. And then, who knows? But somewhere around noon or 1, you begin getting called back into prayer and meditation. And you have time. It's Saturday. There's hours before bed. There's no obligations ahead of you. So you go into prayer and meditation and at 1, and you emerge at 3:30 or 4, right? That's how much time you spent in prayer and soaking it up. And then if you spent that much time in depth, there's an hour of adjustment back to normal consciousness. And then the power that you've absorbed begins to set in, and you begin to experience it that evening, this intense sort of connection with God, possibly. That is so valuable, right? That is so beautiful. That bit of time, and that took a whole day. And that might continue into Sunday. Another leg of that journey might continue into Sunday. And while friendships will always be a welcome light in our lives, that weekend is absolutely more valuable than a trip to the lake to go boating. It is. And it's also more valuable than a hiking trip with 3 or 4 friends. That weekend right there, doing that, taking the time with God and letting this relationship unfold, that is worth more than a social engagement. And so the percentages, right? More time spent with God alone, less time spent with others. There's no rule. There's no percentage we have to require of people because everyone is different. We have different, just naturally we have different draws. Some people are extremely comfortable with hardly ever having social interaction. And some people are extremely comfortable with not having any friends on that other level. And some people would prefer not to have any at all on that level of just hanging out and socializing. And others really need that. It's a true good in their life. So we're not making a rule. You can't have this. You can only have this. Or this percentage is okay. This percentage isn't okay. We can't make those rules, although a little bit of that in the monastery is made. But we don't make those rules. We let the Holy Spirit direct that in our lives. But since they don't understand, since we're talking about that phenomenon right now, since they don't understand, then there's no reason to go over there this weekend, is there? You want to go hiking? Well, go ahead. Go hiking, but go alone. You want to work in the garden? Go ahead and work in that garden, but go ahead and work in that garden alone. Because when you're alone, you're not alone. When you're alone, you can spend your time focusing on God. And this is important even for, married couples, maybe even more important. If you have a partner, if you're married to someone or in a really significant relationship with someone, then time spent alone is also deeply valuable for you. It's very important. And I want to talk about why a little bit, not just for married people, but for everyone. Just why is this so important? And there's the obvious reason is we need to be in relationship with God, and that's best done in silence. But there's also, and I touched on it earlier, and I can't say this well. This isn't, I probably ought to spend, a great deal of thought on this, but because every time I talk about it, I regret how I've said it. But I also think it's because it can't be said very well anyway. And I touched on it earlier, but it has to do with how should the world look? If everything we did was done according to God's will, how would the world look? And why is it we don't hear God's will in every moment? Why don't we? And one of the main reasons why is we begin to align to and we become faithful to our social group. And not only social groups, but mindsets that come with those social groups. And I touched on that in the other video, I think a little, but it's how aligned are you to a certain social group? When you're alone and just thinking about life, what groups pop up that you answer to or that you compare yourself to? Well, that's a really good one, that you compare yourself to. What groups of people and what mindsets, what values do you find yourself comparing yourself to? Those are your God in the idolatry, in the sense of it being idolatry. So, what groups, what kinds of people, what sometimes we might even say principles are above you that you align to and find yourself aligning with so that you can fit in. And it's funny because there's so many now these days, much more diverse than it used to be. There's so many different groups, you can align in so many different ways. But what's common amongst all of them is that the people in these groups are defining and designing character based on feedback from the group. That can be good if the group is deeply committed to a relationship with God. But even in that sense, even in a group like that, perhaps in a monastery, time spent away from that group alone, going straight to God, is still more important. Because, people like us better if we're happy, right? People like us better if we're funny. People like us, depending on the group, people like us better if we're highly successful. People like us better if we're intelligent. Thinking of a woman I knew who was insecure, and she felt like if she just got a PhD, it would allay her insecurity. She would find the confidence she needed in life. And she had the same teacher at me. This was years and years ago. And she had the same teacher as me. And our teacher, Clyde, said that she should not do this. Now, if she had come and said, I have this deep burning interest in such and such a field, and I just feel so compelled to it, I think he would have said, do it. Great, that's great. But what she said, she didn't say that. She said, I'm so insecure. I just know that if I had a PhD, I would feel more confident. And this woman lived, obviously around scholarly types. I don't know her upbringing. It's been years since I've spoken with her, but I'm sure she came from a family with education. So naturally, she just felt if I had that PhD, I would feel more confident. So my teacher said, don't do it. That's a waste of a lot of energy and it won't work. And she didn't listen. And I ran into her just oddly at a store years later, and we sat and caught up. And because, having the first teacher and this teacher happened to be so great. So, whenever you run into someone from back in those times in your life, it's so wonderful to see them. And we just sat down and we talked for an hour. And I said, how are you? And she said, I'm not doing well at all. And she's a Japanese woman, a really neat lady. She said, I'm not doing well at all. I said, well, what's going on? And she said, and she told me, I was insecure and I felt a PhD would fix it. And I talked to Clyde, and Clyde said not to do it, but I felt I had to do it, and I did it, and it didn't work out. And I said, why not? And she said, my insecurity wasn't cured at all. And she said, it's actually now worse because I'm surrounded by people with PhDs who've done much more with their PhDs than me. Which is just great, right? So what should she have done? Well, I don't know if she should have gotten a PhD in the long run or not. I don't know that. I couldn't say. But we know that her motivation for doing it was completely defined by what certain people in the world would think of her. We know that. And it feels like I should say right now that some people listening to this are doing it with their mother-in-law and their father-in-law. and their mother and their father. But right? They're so like this, I need to be more like this to fit with them. Right? So now you're changing your entire way of living and being so that it fits with people around you. And that is idolatry. That is idolatry. We don't want to judge it, but that is idolatry. That is the opposite of the way to union with God. The way to union with God is, to the best of our ability to renounce all of that and say, God, where do you really want me and what do you want me to be doing? And that is hard enough to hear, right? In a deep way. That's hard enough to be led into in a deep way without our attachment to pleasing the people around us. Or without our, sort of principled notions that if I didn't accomplish this much, my life wasn't worthwhile. So the deepest reason to spend time alone and not aligned to social groups is to go straight to God so you can spend time with God. But the supporting reason is because when you're in those groups, if you're honest with yourself, you find you're completely prey to whatever games your ego is up to supporting its existence. Right? I'm smart too. I'm fit also, right? I also make a lot of money. I also have investments in the stock market. I also am an artist. I'm also very artistic. I'm also a hippie, whatever, right? Whatever the form it takes is diverse. But what is happening is the same everywhere. If you go to the poorest part of town, you'll see it happening. And it's different. It looks different. If you go to the wealthiest part of town, it'll look different, but it's exactly the same thing that's happening. Similar haircuts, similar clothes, similar everything, right? And the haircuts and the clothes really don't matter, but it matters a lot why that haircut, why those clothes. Why? Why that haircut, why those clothes, right? Why that education? Why that school, right? Why this neighborhood? Why this job? Why this interest in art? It's interesting. None of the things we're talking about are evil in any way. But all of them can be completely idolatrous, provided our motivation for doing them is not God leading us into it. So I hope this helps. It's related to they won't understand. They won't understand. People will not understand this. If you almost have to imagine yourself as a spirit. Just back up off of planet Earth, okay? Get up in the clouds somewhere, up in space, and look down at the planet. And then have God up behind you, right? We know God isn't like a physical body, but God's power in relationship with you, right behind you. You're both looking down at Earth. And imagine asking this question. God, I'm willing to go down and have a lifetime down there. What do you want me to do? What would you have me do? I'll do anything you want. Just tell me what it is. That's how it's supposed to be. That. Not what will my friends think. Not what will my parents think. Not that. Except when that aligns to God's will. Not what will the culture I'm a part of think. Not what will the religious people at my church think. Not that. Not what does my political party think. Right? Not just name any sort of institution or group of people that you sort of answer to or compare yourself to or try to align to. And realize you must divorce yourself from all of that and get down to what does God want of me? And you're really seeking this out. And we know it's just not just turn left or turn right. You know, we know God isn't just like, well, turn left instead of right today. Wear blue instead of purple. I mean, it can involve those areas, but we know that's not ultimately it. It's a state of being. And that's the other thing, too. When you enter a social group, it's a dynamic, right? There's an energetic dynamic, and you find yourself vibrating in such a way to fit in that dynamic. How much time spent outside of where God wants to place you energetically in your state of being? How much time is good time? And how much time is productive and how much time is wasted? These are very important questions. And most contemplatives just begin to notice this because their social interactions begin to diminish or become less satisfying, or sort of start to fall apart or become more distant. And this is really the work of the Holy Spirit in your life, but it's happening before we notice it, and then once we notice it, we don't like it, and we have to come to some kind of terms with it. And all of this, right, being led by the Spirit in some way, connecting with God in some deep way that, apophatically. If you haven't watched Apophaticism, now watch it because it's so important. But all of this is done in an apophatic way. But this being led by the Spirit and being transformed by God and becoming whatever God intends us to be on this planet, I think it's hard work. I don't think this is easy at all. I don't think that there's, I think that is quite difficult. It can be more difficult for some than others, obviously. But I think this is a very difficult part of the path. And it requires a lot of time alone to find it. And it requires being in the world but not of it. Right? So I wanted to bring up clothing. It's almost irrelevant. It's like the shallowest way to talk about it, but I think it plays a role. Think of how you dress and why you dress that way. And now you may find no hitches in this, but you may find, though, that there's a lot of hitches in it of why you wear what you wear. Just why. The clothes you're wearing, I mean, aside from extreme examples, there's just nothing wrong with them. They're neither sinful nor good. They're just clothes. But why you wear them matters a lot. It matters a ton. So just imagine this example. Somebody who dresses very nicely all the time. Very nicely. Finds out that the entire motivation behind that is egoic. It's to impress in some way, to present power, or, any number of just egoic minded motivations. Or to push people away. There's a way to dress for that too, just to keep people away. That there's all this. To whatever degree those motivations are egoic, those motivations have to change. And the way they dress might have to change too. But what if they're in the business world and there's just a certain level of dress required, period, whether you like it or not? Do they have to quit that job and get out of that business world? No, of course not. But they have to unplug from the motivations of why they're wearing what they're wearing. And they might change some things subtly, but they might have to still, just for their requirements in the world, they may have to dress a certain way, and that can't keep them from union with God. That's not possible. But their attachment to it, and especially the reasons why they're attached to it, could be enough to keep a person from union with God completely. And we're talking about clothing here. Clothing. It's almost nothing. And yet, it can really matter on the deeper levels of things. That has to do with schooling. That has to do with whether you take that promotion or you don't. Whether you seek that promotion or you don't. Many things in this world are just neither good nor evil. They just are what they are. But our reasons for pursuing them, that stuff matters deeply. And we have to get to the bottom of that. And that is very difficult to do when you are answering to your social group. To the degree that that social group is egoic, it is more difficult to do. I think that's about everything I wanted to say. One last thing, in the Orthodox Church, there is God. There's a Christian religion. There is God, okay, and God is the supreme, infinite being who was not made by anyone else, right? You think about, well, what came before that? What came before that, right? What came before the Big Bang, right? What came before the thing that came before the Big Bang? And eventually at some point you get to God, which the answer to what came before God is nothing. And what made God? The answer to that is nothing. Nothing made God. God is that being whose existence is necessary, right? God is that being whose existence is pure being, who is being itself. That's God, which I think, by the way, it makes me queasy to think about it. That thought always brings me to some, it's a really deep place. That God, that thing that came before everything else, right? And then next are these uncreated energies. And these are the energies that God didn't make. They also have always existed. And then, see, God eventually created beings, right? Like me and you. And then we participate in those energies. Okay, it's a fancy, just long-winded way of saying there's energies. There are these energies. And these energies are downloaded into people's souls, and then we sort of convert them into words and joy and laughter and activity. Okay. And for the saints and the sages, from the uncreated energies that are downloaded into them, and their expression of them is very clean. There's almost no hitch. There's certainly an imprint of identity, right? Whatever the saint or sage is, it's their unique imprint. But whatever comes out of them is more or less as clean as what came into them from God. That's the saintly people, which is a very high place, obviously, and we're all just hoping to get cleaner over time. But that's what it's like to be all the way in, kind of enlightened. Well, you're bathing in energies when you're around people. You're bathing in their energies. And you're soaking them up. And you're making them a part of you. How much time should you spend soaking up those energies as compared to shedding your own polluted energies and absorbing God directly? How much time? This is the question. And when they don't understand, that's a piece of God's answer to you. And God is probably not saying, cut yourself off from all people forever. I doubt it. I mean, I don't know. It could be, but I doubt that. For most people, certainly that's not it. But God is almost certainly saying, limit it. Limit it. Just limit it. And your reaction of fear to this just happening naturally is unnecessary. It may be a necessary process for you to go through, and that's fine. But it's unnecessary in ultimate terms. Because once you get all the way healed and all that, you're going to spend less time with those people anyway because you're going to be busy. You've got a date. And your date is with God. You've got a date. You can't wait to get home and spend 3 or 4 hours alone with God. You can't wait. And so sometimes life helps us to make those choices. Things fade all on their own. And that's life's way of cooperating with the Holy Spirit to allow us to end up where God wanted us to end up anyway. And I'll probably do an entire segment on this, but as a segue, just as a small piece, I would say that in this present time with the coronavirus going on, so the monks and nuns practice asceticism. That's the first night in the monastery. You give up most of your worldly pleasures. They're just not available to you. And they're limited. And so you kind of die inside and feel the frustration and the anxiety of all these things you used to lean on and didn't know you were leaning on them. And then there's a crisis, and then you find you never needed them, and then deeper peace sets in. That's the monastic way. That isn't our way. I mean, I wouldn't stop someone from doing that if they could pull it off. But we find that we just give our whole lives to God and slowly outgrow those restrictions, those addictions and crutches. But we don't give them up first and then go to God because we're just inundated by them. And if we're married with kids, it's especially difficult for some things. So the coronavirus is here, and it's just invited everybody to practice some asceticism. You can't go shopping. You can't go to restaurants. You can't go to bars. You can't go to large social groups. You can't go to church, probably. Just about every crutch, worldly crutch that you use to gain satisfaction, much of it has been removed from you now. And, there's talk now that if this goes on for much longer, people will start popping, right? People are going to start going a little crazy with it. I just got off the phone with somebody who said, I'm loving this coronavirus thing. I mean, he doesn't love that people have the coronavirus, but he said, I'm loving the time. I'm loving the working from home. I'm loving all of it. And I thought, oh, that's great. Me too. I think that's wonderful. But then we talked about how, we don't know this, but people are discussing that it could possibly, it get extended for 3 more months where the same restrictions apply. And he became very grave, and he said, that wouldn't be okay with me. I won't handle that well. What is that? That's the night of the senses that the monks and nuns all go through on purpose. That's the night of the senses. He's okay now, but he was looking at 2 weeks from now, he'll be back to whatever nightlife he was having. Well, there's no nightlife right now. There isn't any. And so there's that anxiety that builds, and that feeling of rebellion and anger and frustration. That's the night of the senses. We don't practice asceticism. We allow it to evolve within us. But present circumstances have created asceticism for us. And there's a way to, if you tap into that monastically, you can see it as a real gift into your life. Yes, you can't do those things now, and you never needed them. And what you have left, unless you just get online all day, which I hope people are not doing all day, unless you replace it with other addictions like drinking all day, which I guess some people are doing now. If you don't do that, what you find is there's now more time. There's more time. And even the frustration and anxiety of not being able to do what you used to do, if you see that as forced asceticism, if you see that as life teaching you about doing without, and teaching you that you don't need the things that you thought you needed, then you can take that as a gift from God and write it into union with God and come away more free than you went in. So that's just a side note. It's not that important, but it's happening now presently, and I think it matters. And that's what's happening when they don't understand you. That's what's happening when they don't get where you're coming from. I mean, if someone's motivation in life is success, okay, a lot of people are like that. And I'm not judging it. It's what's driving them, success. Well, that's what gets them up in the morning, right? That's what defines every decision they make. And that success can be approval from a father or mother, or there could be other links, right, that enforce this notion that success is everything. And that success can take different forms, obviously. If that's what's driving them completely, and you were friends with that person, maybe you were similar, and now you've found the contemplative path, I mean, there's a fundamentally different motivation system going on now that creates fundamentally different energies, moods, attitudes, and activities, and opinions about life. All of it is now formed differently. Of course, you shouldn't be surprised when there's less in common now. Not as much to talk about. There should be no surprise. There should be no scandal. That's okay. They're okay too, and you're okay. You just might not need to hang out as much as you used to hang out. You might not have as much in common as you used to have in common. And that is all right. That is all right. Okay, I hope this helps. I'll put it in the YouTube. They won't understand too. Okay, thanks for listening, everybody.